700 feet above Negros Island, the P-38 Lightning was already beyond saving. Its airspeed had bled down through 130 miles per hour. The left wing dropped violently. The nose pitched upward into a stall that no amount of control input could recover. Both Allison engines were still running. The control surfaces still responded. But physics had already made its decision. Within 3 seconds, the most successful American fighter pilot still flying combat in the Pacific would be dead. Not from enemy fire. From a choice he made to protect another man. The morning of January 7, 1945 began heavy and gray over Dulag airstrip on Leyte. Low clouds hung across the central Philippines like wet canvas. Visibility shifted from moment to moment. Ceilings dropped unexpectedly. The kind of weather that made flying dangerous long before the enemy even appeared. Major Thomas B. Maguire Jr. had already been airborne since before dawn. His aircraft, a P-38L Lightning, was one of 4 fighters from the 431st Fighter Squadron climbing west toward Negros Island. Their mission sounded simple. Locate Japanese aircraft. Destroy them before they could threaten the American invasion forces spreading across the Philippine Islands. But nothing about the tactical environment that morning was simple. The P-38 Lightning was a unique machine. Twin engines, twin booms, a long central cockpit pod carrying 4 50 caliber machine guns and a 20 mm cannon. It had been designed primarily as a high-altitude interceptor. Its 2 Allison V-1710 engines, equipped with turbo superchargers, delivered their best performance above 20,000 feet, where compressed air restored the power lost in thin atmosphere. At those altitudes, the Lightning was formidable, fast, stable, devastating in a dive. But down low, the aircraft became something else entirely. Heavier, sluggish. Its wings struggled to maintain lift at low speeds. And its weight-to-lift ratio punished any pilot who attempted tight turns below 5,000 feet. Maguire knew this better than almost anyone alive. Every P-38 pilot knew it. The aircraft's technical manuals warned clearly. Avoid sustained turning engagements below 10,000 feet. Maintain energy. Extend away. Climb. Then re-engage from advantage. Never sacrifice altitude simply to chase a shot. That morning, Maguire's aircraft carried external fuel tanks. 2 165-gallon drop tanks hung beneath the Lightning's center section. They were necessary for the long patrol across the Visayan Sea, but they also transformed the aircraft's handling. Fully loaded, a P-38L weighed nearly 20,000 pounds. The additional drag reduced roll rate. The turning radius widened dramatically. Any high-G maneuver risked compressor stall in the engines or structural stress on the pylons holding the tanks. Standard procedure was simple. If enemy aircraft appeared, jettison the tanks immediately. Lose the weight. Restore maneuverability. Fight the aircraft the way it was designed to fight. The 4 American fighters crossed the coastline of Negros Island at roughly 15,000 feet. Below them stretched jungle valleys and scattered airfields like Fabrica and Bacolod, where Japanese aircraft were known to stage operations. The sky seemed quiet. Too quiet. No contacts. No contrails. For several minutes, it appeared the mission would end without combat. Then the geometry changed. Below the American formation, at barely 2,000 feet, a single Japanese fighter crossed their path. The aircraft was quickly identified. A Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar. Lightweight. Extremely agile. The primary fighter used by the Japanese Army Air Force throughout much of the Pacific. In level flight, the Oscar was slower than the P-38. But in a low-altitude turning fight, the Japanese aircraft held every advantage. Maguire made his decision instantly. The American formation rolled into a diving attack. Altitude converted into speed. For Lightning fighters plunging toward the lone enemy aircraft. The Oscar reacted immediately. Its pilot yanked the aircraft into a tight, aggressive turn. A maneuver no heavy P-38 could match. The American fighters overshot. Their dive speed carried them past the target before their guns could bear. This was the moment doctrine demanded disengagement. Extend. Climb. Reset the fight. Use altitude to regain the advantage. But the situation changed again almost immediately. More Japanese fighters appeared. Accounts differ on the exact number. Some reports mention 4. Others suggest 7. They may have scrambled from nearby airfields or already been airborne on patrol. Whatever the number, the single Oscar was suddenly no longer alone. The fight began to scatter across the lower atmosphere above Negros Island. Altitude disappeared rapidly. Within minutes, the engagement dropped below 3,000 feet, then lower, below 2,000 feet. The American P-38s were now fighting exactly where they should never be fighting. Low, heavy, still carrying external fuel tanks. Some pilots had managed to jettison theirs during the dive. Others had not. Fuel states varied across the flight, but Major Thomas Maguire's tanks were still attached. At low altitude, with external stores, surrounded by enemy fighters specifically designed for low-level maneuverability, the American flight had surrendered every advantage the P-38 possessed. The engagement had become something pilots dreaded most. A knife fight in a phone booth. If this kind of history matters to you, consider tapping like and subscribing. Because stories like this one deserve to be remembered. Thomas Buchanan Maguire Jr. had been born on August 1, 1920, in Ridgewood, New Jersey. His father was an automotive engineer. His mother was a determined woman with ambitious hopes for her only son. The marriage ended early in Thomas's childhood. He was raised primarily by his mother in Sebring, Florida, where she worked as a real estate broker. Maguire was not physically imposing, just 5'7", slightly built, with a boyish face that made him appear younger than his age. Academically, he was capable, but not exceptional. He enrolled at Georgia Tech to study aeronautical engineering. Like many young men of his generation, he had become fascinated with aviation. The stories of barnstormers, the legend of Charles Lindbergh, the romance of flight. But what truly set Maguire apart was not raw talent. It was precision. He approached flying the way an engineer approaches a mechanical system. Every variable documented, every procedure memorized, every contingency planned in advance. His instructors noticed it immediately. He was methodical, disciplined, sometimes almost overly cautious. He preferred following established procedures rather than improvising. He earned his pilot wings in February 1942. Soon afterward, he was assigned to the 49th Fighter Group in Australia, flying P-38s into the brutal air war over New Guinea. The Pacific Theater in 1942 was unforgiving. Japanese air power dominated the skies. American pilots often flew outnumbered, operating from primitive jungle airstrips, facing opponents with more combat experience and highly refined tactics. Maguire survived those early months through discipline. He studied the P-38 Lightning obsessively. He knew its limitations as thoroughly as its strengths. He understood that the aircraft's handling deteriorated rapidly below 200 miles per hour indicated airspeed. He knew exactly at what altitude the turbo superchargers shifted from military power to combat power. He could calculate fuel consumption at different throttle settings with near mathematical precision. In combat, that knowledge produced something unusual among fighter pilots: restraint. Where others pressed attacks into bad geometry, Maguire disengaged. Where others chased damaged enemy aircraft toward mountainous terrain, Maguire let them go. He waited, positioned himself carefully, selected his shots deliberately, and never sacrificed altitude or energy for a marginal chance at a kill. At first, the results accumulated slowly. His first aerial victory came in August 1943 over WWII. By the end of that year, he had 7 confirmed kills. By mid-1944, the number reached 20. By December 1944, Thomas Maguire had 38 confirmed victories, second only to one man, Major Richard Bong. But Bong and Maguire fought very differently. Bong was instinctive, aggressive, blessed with exceptional situational awareness. He flew on reflex. Maguire flew on calculation. Where Bong trusted instinct, Maguire trusted preparation. The rivalry between them was never officially acknowledged, but everyone in 5th Fighter Command knew it existed. Both men were racing toward history, toward the title of America's leading fighter ace. By early 1945, Richard Bong had already reached 40 victories. He was pulled out of combat and sent back to the United States. Warbird tours, test pilot work. The military wanted their top ace alive for propaganda. But Thomas Maguire was still in combat, still flying, still hunting, and he needed only 2 more victories to tie Bong's record. 3 to surpass it. The pressure was always there. Quiet, mathematical, sitting in the back of his mind every time he climbed into a cockpit. Yet the very system that had kept Maguire alive through more than 200 combat missions depended on one rule above all others: altitude. The P-38 Lightning was built to fight high, above 15,000 feet, and ideally above 20,000. That was where the aircraft dominated. That was where Thomas Maguire was most dangerous. And on the morning of January 7, 1945, he was now fighting less than 1,000 feet above the ground, exactly where he never should have been. For nearly 2 years of combat, Thomas Maguire had followed 3 rules. Rules that kept him alive when dozens of other fighter pilots had not survived their first months of war. The first rule was altitude discipline. Maguire refused to be dragged into low-level fights where Japanese aircraft held the advantage. The second was energy management. In aerial combat, speed and altitude were currencies. Spend them wisely, and you survived. Spend them carelessly, and you died. Maguire entered engagements with speed in reserve, diving through targets rather than turning with them. After every attack, he extended away, climbed, and reset the fight. He rarely allowed his airspeed to drop below the Lightning's optimal maneuvering range. The third rule was formation integrity. A single P-38 was vulnerable, but a coordinated flight of 4 was something else entirely. A moving weapons system with overlapping fields of fire and mutual protection. Maguire flew as an element leader, always maintaining position with his wingman. He protected the formation. He never abandoned discipline simply to chase another victory. These principles had earned him 38 confirmed kills. They had also kept him alive. But the weeks leading up to January 7, 1945, had been frustrating. Mission after mission, patrol after patrol, and almost no contact with the enemy. Japanese air power in the Philippines was collapsing under relentless American pressure. But individual fighters still operated from hidden airstrips and scattered forward fields. Finding them required luck as much as skill. Just days earlier, during escort missions over Mindoro, Maguire had finally seen combat again. On December 26, 1944, he engaged Japanese fighters and scored 3 additional victories, raising his total to 38. Now he was close. Very close. The entire 5th Fighter Command knew it. 2 more victories would tie Richard Bong's record of 40. 3 would surpass it. But those victories had come at a cost. The December engagement had turned into a prolonged maneuvering fight, something Maguire normally avoided. He had pushed harder than usual, perhaps because the record was now within reach. His squadron commander, Colonel Charles MacDonald, noticed. In the days afterward, MacDonald spoke with him privately. He warned Maguire not to let the race for victories compromise his discipline. Maguire acknowledged the warning. But pressure has a way of following pilots into the cockpit, especially when history is within reach. On the morning of January 7th, Maguire led a 4-ship flight. His wingmen included Captain Edwin Weaver, Major Jack Rittmeyer, and Lieutenant Douglas Thorpe. All experienced pilots. All capable. But none possessed the same depth of combat experience Maguire had accumulated over more than 200 missions. In formation, they would follow his lead. The mission briefing that morning was routine. Fighter sweep over Negros Island. Engage targets of opportunity. Maintain altitude advantage. Jettison external tanks before combat. Standard procedures. Procedures Maguire had followed for nearly 2 years. Procedures that had kept him alive against an enemy often flying aircraft far better suited for low-altitude maneuvering. The question was simple. Would he follow them again today? The first contact came at 7:45 a.m. The lone Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar, spotted beneath the American formation, was likely not hunting for them. It may have been a reconnaissance flight or a communications aircraft, but its presence suggested something else. More Japanese fighters might be nearby, possibly scrambling from Fabrica Airfield, possibly already airborne. Maguire committed to the attack. The 4 P-38s rolled into their dive. Altitude converted instantly into speed. The Lightnings accelerated through 300 miles per hour, then 400, their twin booms vibrating as they approached the aircraft's structural limits. The Oscar grew rapidly in Maguire's gun sight, but the Japanese pilot had already seen the attack forming above him. He snapped his aircraft into a hard left turn. The maneuver used the Oscar's greatest strength, its incredibly tight turning radius. A Ki-43 could outturn a fully loaded P-38 P-38 by nearly half. At low altitude, that difference could decide the fight in seconds. Maguire did not attempt to match the turn. Instead, he executed a high-speed slashing pass. His guns fired briefly as the Oscar crossed his nose. Then he pulled upward and extended away to reset the attack. Textbook P-38 tactics. But the engagement refused to remain textbook. Additional Japanese fighters appeared. Records disagree on exactly how many. 4, 6, possibly even more. Whatever the number, the situation changed instantly. What had begun as a controlled interception became a chaotic aerial melee. The American formation began to fragment. Pilots maneuvered individually to avoid enemy attacks. Altitude disappeared rapidly. 3,000 feet, 2,000, then lower. The P-38s were no longer extending away. They were turning, trying to keep the Oscars in sight, trying to prevent them from achieving firing angles. And in that moment, the fight moved into the exact environment the Japanese fighters were designed for. Low altitude, tight maneuvering. Maguire's external tanks were still attached. Why he had not jettisoned them remains unclear. Perhaps the dive had happened too quickly. Perhaps the fight evolved before he could. Or perhaps after weeks of uneventful missions, muscle memory simply failed to trigger the release. Whatever the reason, his aircraft now carried nearly 400 pounds of unnecessary weight beneath its fuselage. Weight that slowed roll rate. Weight that increased stall speed. Weight that would soon become critical. The fight descended below 1,000 feet. At this altitude, the Lightning's turbo-superchargers provided little advantage. The Allison engines still delivered power. But the aircraft's sheer mass now worked against every maneuver. Maguire was flying a heavy interceptor in terrain designed for agile fighters. The tactical geometry had completely reversed. One of his wingmen, most likely Major Jack Rittmeyer, according to later accounts, suddenly found himself in danger. An Oscar had maneuvered behind him, closing rapidly. In aerial combat, this meant only seconds before gunfire. The Ki-43's twin machine guns were lighter than the Lightning's cannon and heavy machine guns. But at close range they were deadly. Rittmeyer was trapped in a defensive turn, perhaps damaged, perhaps simply outmaneuvered. The exact details remain uncertain, filtered through the chaos of battle and the fragmented memories of pilots fighting for survival. But Maguire saw it, and he understood immediately. What happened next would define the final moment of his life. He turned toward the threat. The maneuver violated everything he had practiced for 2 years. Maguire pulled his heavy, tank-laden Lightning into a hard turn at roughly 700 feet above the terrain. His target was the Oscar behind his wingman. If he could drive the Japanese pilot off, or destroy him outright, his wingman might survive. But the physics were already working against him. A P-38L carrying external tank stalled at around 120 miles per hour in level flight. In a steep bank, stall speed increased dramatically. A 60-degree bank doubled the effective load on the wings, raising stall speed toward 170 miles per hour. Maguire's turn was even steeper. He needed to pull the nose upward while banking sharply to bring his guns onto the Oscar. That combination did 2 dangerous things simultaneously. It increased stall speed, and it bled away airspeed. The Lightning slowed rapidly. At some point below 150 miles per hour, the left wing stopped producing lift. The aircraft snapped violently. The left wing dropped. The nose pitched upward. Then the Lightning rolled abruptly as the stall became asymmetric. The aircraft had departed controlled flight, the beginning of a spin. At 20,000 feet, a skilled pilot could recover. Push the nose down. Opposite rudder. Unload the wings. The P-38 would dive, regain speed, and return to control. But Maguire was not at 20,000 feet. He was at 700. There was no altitude left. The Lightning rolled inverted as it fell. Maguire may have tried to recover. The controls would still have responded partially. The engines were still producing power. But the mathematics had already been completed. The aircraft struck the ground near the western coast of Negros Island in a steep, nose-down impact. There was no fire. The fuel tanks were nearly empty after the long patrol. The wreckage scattered across rocky ground and low vegetation. Major Thomas Buchanan Maguire Jr. was killed instantly. The air battle continued without him. The remaining American pilots, suddenly without their leader, fought their way out of the engagement. Some Japanese aircraft may have been damaged. Others escaped. Historical accounts differ. But one fact remains clear. The second highest scoring American fighter ace of the war had died not chasing glory, but trying to save another pilot. Maguire's turn into the attack saved his wingman. The Oscar that had been closing on the American fighter suddenly broke away, either to avoid Maguire's guns or because the geometry of the fight had changed. The pilot Maguire protected, most likely Major Jack Rittmeyer, though accounts differ, escaped the engagement alive. The exchange had already been completed. The most successful active American fighter ace still flying combat in the Pacific had traded his life for another pilot's survival. The numbers were final. 38 confirmed aerial victories. More than 200 combat missions. Nearly 2 years of continuous fighting. All of it ending in a 3-second aerodynamic stall 700 feet above a Philippine island most Americans would never hear about. The score never reached 40. The record remained unbroken. Richard Bong stayed America's leading fighter ace. But Maguire had proven something Bong never needed to prove. The record had never really been the point. The Japanese fighters that witnessed the crash did not aggressively pursue the remaining American aircraft. The sky, already chaotic, scattered even further. Individual fighters turned away in different directions, some back toward the coast, others toward the airfields they had likely launched from. Whether this dispersal came from tactical caution, low fuel, empty ammunition belts, or simple confusion is impossible to know. Japanese radio transmissions from that engagement have never survived in usable form. American intelligence summaries mention intercepted chatter acknowledging the crash, but provide no detailed tactical explanation. What is clearly documented is what happened next on the American side. The surviving pilots returned to Dulag airstrip. Their leader's position in the formation was empty. Initial reports were brief. Major Maguire had gone down over Negros Island. Cause unknown. Status unknown. Search and rescue aircraft were not immediately available. The Philippine campaign was still active, and resources were stretched across multiple island operations. Within hours, the news spread across 5th Fighter Command. Major Thomas B. Maguire Jr. 38 victories. Missing in action. Presumed dead. Confirmation came later. American ground troops advancing through Negros located the wreckage. Maguire's body was recovered at the crash site. Personal effects confirmed his identity. The aircraft itself had been destroyed beyond recovery. But investigators studying the debris pattern reached a clear conclusion. The lightning had impacted the ground at steep angle and high speed. There was no evidence of enemy gunfire. No missing control surfaces. No structural failure. Witness accounts from the other pilots had already suggested the same thing. Maguire's aircraft had not been hit. It had simply departed controlled flight during a low-altitude turn. The official analysis reached an uncomfortable truth. Maguire had stalled his aircraft while defending a wingman. The P-38, still carrying external fuel tanks, had exceeded its aerodynamic limits at an altitude too low for recovery. The fatal blow had not come from Japanese guns. It had come from the intersection of physics, weight, and altitude. The irony was impossible to ignore. For 2 years, Maguire had survived precisely by avoiding this kind of fight. He had preached altitude discipline, energy management, formation integrity. He had rejected the instinct that killed many fighter pilots, the urge to turn one more time, chase one more shot, gamble one more maneuver. But on January 7, 1945, he abandoned those rules. The question lingered afterward in ready rooms and officers' clubs across the Pacific. Had he done it deliberately? Or had the pressure of chasing Bong's record finally worn down his discipline? Neither answer brought much comfort. What remained was the official record. On March 7, 1946, President Harry S. Truman approved the Medal of Honor for Major Thomas B. Maguire Jr. The citation followed the precise language typical of military honors, formal, controlled, stripped of the chaos that had filled those final seconds above Negros Island. It read in part, responding to the urgent need of a comrade during a low-altitude engagement with the enemy, he voluntarily placed his own aircraft in a dangerous position. His utter disregard for his own safety and his gallant self-sacrifice reflect the highest traditions of military service. The citation spoke of courage, of sacrifice, of duty. It did not mention external fuel tanks. It did not mention stall speed. It did not mention the mathematics of aerodynamic failure. Instead, It translated a complex tactical tragedy into something simpler, a story of sacrifice. And in truth, that story was not wrong. After the war, Maguire's remains were returned to the United States. He was reburied at Arlington National Cemetery. Today his grave lies among thousands of others, white stones stretching across quiet green hills. To most visitors, it is just another marker. But to those who know the story, the name carries a different weight. His legacy survives elsewhere. Maguire Air Force Base in New Jersey, established in 1948, bears his name. Today its runways host enormous military transport aircraft rather than fighters. Few who pass through the base know the full story of the young fighter pilot it commemorates. And perhaps that is the final irony. The popular imagination pictures fighter aces as fearless hunters, aggressive warriors piling up victories through daring skill. But the reality of survival in aerial combat was very different. The pilots who lived longest were often the most cautious, the most disciplined, the most methodical. Fear did not disappear. It was managed, controlled through procedure and calculation. Thomas Maguire embodied that paradox better than almost any American pilot of his generation. His victories came not from recklessness, but from preparation. His reputation rested on precision, not audacity. By every logical measure, he was exactly the kind of pilot who should have survived the war. Yet in the end, he died in the kind of fight he had spent 2 years avoiding. A low-altitude turning battle against aircraft designed specifically for that environment. It suggests something important about the limits of discipline under pressure. The race with Bong. The expectations of an entire command watching his score rise. Those pressures existed. Whether they influenced his final decision cannot be proven, but they cannot be ignored. What can be stated with certainty is this. When the moment arrived, when a wingman's life was in danger, Thomas Maguire made a choice. He chose the man beside him over the record ahead of him. He turned into a fight he could not win. Because you do not leave your wingman. The P-38 that vanished above Negros Island carried 38 victories, 2 years of combat experience, hundreds of calculated decisions. But in its final seconds, it carried something even more important. A pilot who honored the oldest rule of fighter combat. Protect the man flying beside you. The Japanese aircraft that witnessed the crash disappeared into the Philippine morning. The American pilots returned to base with an empty space in their formation. The war continued for another 7 months. And Thomas Maguire's name entered history, forever frozen at 24 years old, forever approaching a record he would never reach. The physics of his death can be calculated easily today. Stall speed, bank angle, remaining altitude. Any student pilot could run the numbers. But the decision itself, the choice to turn, the willingness to trade everything for another pilot's survival, that calculation exists outside any technical manual. It lives only in the quiet, unspoken contract between pilots. 700 feet above Negros Island. Thomas Maguire honored that contract completely. The cost was exact, but the meaning remains.